Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is October 4th, a Friday around here, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking about this Saturday upcoming and how it feels like it's a little too quiet. I think everyone kind of shares this sentiment at this point in the week, but I'm going to break down the couple of places that we could see a number of different chaos moves in this upcoming weekend. Then we'll get into a little bit of a week 6 wrap-up. We'll get into all of the different games that we haven't had a chance to get to throughout the week. We'll also get to the game that happened yesterday. Texas State gets a big win over Troy. Then we'll get a little bit of an update on all the questions I have going into week 6. I think one of the bigger ones is what's on the table in Tallahassee. Obviously, a lot of steam has been taken out of that matchup, but I think there's still a lot to play for in that matchup down there against Florida State and Clemson. Then I'll give you my best bets for this upcoming week. Definitely one that is really hard to get a beat on. As we'll talk about, it's going to be a little bit chaotic, so hard to get a beat on exactly where I want to go. But then we'll finish it off with all of the headlines we haven't had a chance to get to throughout the week. We'll make sure we update you with those at the end of the show. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use that super chat feature at the bottom of the chat on the Sports Network page. Just click that $, add any question, comment you'd like, and we can have a fun back and forth about it. Definitely want this to be as interactive as possible, so utilize that as you see fit. Also, gsmcpodcast.net is still up and running. That does the exact same thing. So either of those will work more than fine. Would love for you guys to get a little bit involved here. But let's get into this, because I think everyone kind of understands this at this point, but college football is one of those sports. When you have a ton of games that people aren't overly excited about, you don't have that marquee matchup that we probably should have in this week, but Florida State decided to do Florida State things. But at the end of the day, it's one of those weeks where nothing really jumps out. You know, you're not overly waiting for Saturday by any means. And then Saturday comes, and everything goes crazy. There's so many different upsets. There's tons of teams that are playing in games that you had no business playing in, to be totally fair. And I think it's going to be really, really incredible. There's a number of big-time games. I mean, there's a in-state rivalry down in Florida, UCF heading to Gainesville. There's a huge game for UNLV this upcoming weekend that could set them off on a G5 path. But at the end of the day, 9 ranked teams play on the road this upcoming weekend. It is going to be tough, and I believe 14 different teams play conference games on the road, or a lot of teams play conference games on the road, but at the end of the day, I believe there's a number of big-time teams that play conference games on the road. It's going to be really tough for them to deal with that, and we'll see how well they can go through it, but let's kind of get into this here for a second, and I'll break it down in no uncertain terms, all of the different areas that you could be looking at, kind of different upsets, and why they would be happening, in a sense at least, why they would be happening, not nitty-gritty, to be fair, but ranked teams that are taking on some dangerous teams is Oregon-Michigan State is a really interesting one. It's one that, frankly, I don't think a lot of Oregon fans are worried about it. I don't know if you should be worried about it. But at the end of the day, Aiden Childs on the other side of the field is one of those players that any given Saturday, he can play like an elite player in football. He absolutely can be one of those guys that totally takes over a game with his legs, makes a couple of big-time throws, and then you look up in the third quarter and Oregon's down 7 points. I don't expect that to happen, but going on the road to East Lansing is not an easy thing to do, and we'll figure out if they can handle it. Then you have Ohio State hosting Iowa. It's definitely one of those games that I don't know if anyone really trusts Iowa to score the amount of points that they need to. Maybe they have a little bit of that 2017 magic in them, but at the end of the day, I think there's one of those games that we don't really know who Ohio State is yet. I feel pretty good that they're a very, very good elite team that absolutely can win a title, but they haven't really been tested yet. Obviously, going up to Michigan State was a little bit of a test. This is going to be a huge one, no two ways about that. And then you do have Georgia facing off against Auburn, another one where Georgia just needs to respond. There were holes in that Alabama game that were exposed that Auburn could very well expose as well, but you have to make sure you come ready and then you see if you can take care of business. I think they will, but definitely one of those games that Auburn's going to come in ready, and they have a little bit of momentum going on around there. Then you have Boise State hosting Utah State. You have Iowa State inviting Baylor, which is an interesting one to watch out there. Then you have Penn State with UCLA. It's one of those things where none of those games really jump off the page. None of those games you worry about an upset happening, but one absolutely could happen in that group. And then you got the teams that are heading out west, and Michigan-Washington is the one that I want to talk about first because we covered this one. I do think Michigan's going to win. It's going to be a nightmare to deal with. I can absolutely promise you that. Pretty much any game that Michigan has going forward is going to be a nightmare to deal with just by the way that they game plan, the way they go about business. You're not going to blow out a lot of people. You're going to have a really tough time scoring a ton of points. and that means your heart rate's going to be very, very high throughout these games. But they are underdogs going on the road all the way out to Seattle. We'll see how they handle it. I have them winning, but one of those games that's going to be really fun to watch in that night slate. Miami heading all the way out to Cal is another one that I've talked about a number of times this week. I think Cal's trying to take advantage of the opening that the VT game gave them. Maybe Miami comes in a little bit sluggish, and like I talked about yesterday, this game is very, very close at halftime and maybe gets a little bit more interesting in the second half. And then you have UNLV Syracuse, and I think this one's going to be tough to figure out. I think tonight's going to be an incredible matchup. We'll talk about it in a little bit more detail later, but I think when you talk about the ACC races, the G5 CFP race, this is a huge game. Syracuse obviously took a tough loss to Stanford last week, but they're still a very capable team, and at the very least could be one of those teams that anytime they face off against a Clemson, a Miami, they're pretty much the two elite teams in that conference. Once they face off against those teams, they can just play elite football on one Saturday and get a huge win. So all three of those games, I think it's something that we're going to get something out of those games. We are going to get some juice out of Michigan, some juice out of Miami, some juice out of UNLV Syracuse. Frankly, I think all three of those games are going to be absolutely incredible. They'll be incredible for different reasons. Michigan-Washington might be a little bit tougher of a watch, but at the end of the day, I think it's three games that maybe those ranked teams just have a little bit of trouble getting over the hump they need to. Then you got the hostile environment crowd, and Ole Miss leads this off, and it's an absolute nightmare for them to find themselves in this spot going into this week because Columbia, South Carolina is not going to be easy to deal with. I can absolutely promise you that. I've talked about this game a lot. I'm picking South Carolina in it. I fully believe that South Carolina's defensive line is going to be just too much for Ole Miss to handle. I think Ole Miss is not running the ball nearly as much or as effectively as they should. I just think it's going to be a really, really tough matchup at the worst possible moment for Ole Miss. So I don't necessarily love that moment. They're going to have to execute at a really, really high level in a very tough environment a week after they didn't necessarily execute very, very well. So it's going to be a really interesting game, one that I know a lot of people are circling out there, and maybe Ole Miss's season just essentially comes to an end on Saturday, which would be crazy to figure out. But then you got Tennessee at Arkansas. Tennessee hasn't played in 13 days. This is going to be a tough reintroducing to college football. No two ways about that. But obviously got a huge win on the road at Oklahoma for their last game. It's one of those that you don't really worry about this Tennessee team, but there's always that moment. For pretty much every team in the country, there's always that moment where you put up a little bit of a stinker on the road, especially in the SEC, and you look up and you have a number of things to fix on Monday, which very well could be what happens here. And then you got Indiana Northwestern. This is one that should worry the Hoosiers less, but the reality is 14 points makes me a little bit nervous. Also, I think when you have Indiana in the position that they're in, they're just trying to stay undefeated. They're probably always on edge, to be totally fair, because this season is so important. You have so many things going in the right direction. This would be the game that would totally bury you and totally send you back to square one, or it obviously would kickstart you into a really good end of the season that is a pretty favorable schedule. So it's one of those things that you could say, well, Ole Miss is bound to bounce back, or no way Tennessee or Indiana falls to Arkansas or Northwestern. It's one of those things. We can't really necessarily use logic here. We have to necessarily use what college football gives us, which is outright chaos pretty much every single week. Then you got the conference race to finals. You got a couple of big-time games this upcoming weekend that will have something to say with how these conferences shake out. Obviously, the big-time one is Missouri A&M. That is going to be one that, at the very least, will give you an idea of who that second tier of the SEC is. I think everyone feels pretty good saying Alabama, Texas, Georgia, Tennessee are the elite teams in that conference. Then you have Ole Miss, you have Missouri, you have a couple other teams right around there. I think the winner of this game would be firmly in that second group. I think they'd be a very dangerous team going forward and would obviously be a huge win for especially Missouri with the schedule they have coming up. Then you got SMU Louisville, and I think when you talk about this one, the ACC is just wide open. There's no one that really has a total beat on that conference. Obviously, Clemson and Miami have started to separate, but that could change in a hurry. Obviously, it could change on Saturday with a couple of interesting games coming up for those teams, but it's one of those games, kind of like that Missouri A&M one, where you got to have that second tier somewhere. You got to have that third team, that fourth team that's in that conversation. The winner of this game is likely that team. And then you do have Rutgers, Nebraska. I think it's one of those games, kind of like Louisville, SMU, where maybe it's not a team that's going to compete for the Big Ten. Absolutely a team that could really push a lot of the elite teams and also possibly be in that conversation at the very least towards the end of the season. So it's one of those games that maybe doesn't jump off the page in terms of the names on it, but Absolutely, we'll have a lot to say, and then you have a group of five games that are going to have a ton to say. I think Texas Tech, Arizona, Iowa, Ohio State are going to have a number of things to say about what their conference is this upcoming year. And then finally, you got just the college football moments, the ones that you would never expect to happen, the ones that you do not expect to happen, but end up sneaking up on you. And I think you have Alabama at Vandy. Probably shouldn't happen, but at the end of the day, coming off a huge emotional win, maybe Alabama's a little bit sluggish to start that one. USC against Minnesota, I just think isn't a great matchup for USC. I think it's going to be really, really tough for them to deal with a team that can run the ball very effectively, but also can hit that deep shot every once in a while, unlike what Michigan could do. So it's going to be really interesting to see that one develop. And then obviously you have Clemson, Florida State. Frankly, one that should not be one that we're confused about or one that we're not necessarily super excited about. But here we are. Clemson should be able to handle business. Frankly, I think they should be able to blow out Florida State. And if they don't, then maybe we have some questions. But at the end of the day, it's three games that you probably aren't picking the underdog to win it by any means, but absolutely could be one that develops into that in a hurry. So it's going to be really, really fun to watch all of this unfold. I think it's one of those things that we've had a top 10 team fall in a number of different weeks this season. I think the only week we didn't was week 3, and that was a week where Missouri really struggled. So it's one of those things that there's not an off week in college football. There's not a week where you can say, I'll do what I need to do this weekend. I'll make plans with my girlfriend so they feel a little bit better about the rest of the season. Or, I'm going to take a little bit of time off, relax on Saturday. I promise you're going to miss out on some big-time games. You're going to miss out on some games that are going to have a lot to say about the rest of the season, and we'll see how it develops going forward, but I just think it's one of those things. You don't want to show up to work on Monday and say you missed the big-time game. So it's going to be a crazy weekend. It's one of those that is going to lull you to sleep and then punch you in the face. It's going to be really, really fun. So definitely strap in, be very excited about this upcoming one, because I think it's going to be one that we remember for quite some time, at least in this season of college football. But let's take our first break here. And when we come back, we're going to break down all the games we just haven't had a chance to get to yet, including that game that happened yesterday, Texas State, a huge win over Troy. We'll break it all down right after this, so stick with us.